Right, hello everybody, and welcome to our second session of today. This one is about the changing face of manufacturing and how a new focus on making can support Scotland's circular economy ambitions. Now, my name is Maxine Perella, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm an environmental journalist specialising in the field of the circular economy. It's an agenda I'm very passionate about, and I've actually moved up to Dundee in Scotland because I'm so passionate about it, having lived in the southeast for many years. So I'm chairing this session. It's going to really look at how circular economy thinking can stimulate future opportunities for manufacturing and also remanufacturing in Scotland. Now, this discussion is quite timely. As we saw earlier today, the announcement by Richard Lochhead to invest in a remanufacturing hub for Scotland is absolutely fantastic news. And I think it really demonstrates the country's leadership in this area. There are also other developments. There's a lot of noise at the moment being created around remanufacture. 2 parliamentary inquiries have been launched into the UK's remanufacturing potential. And there are also active moves to develop a wider UK Centre of Excellence for remanufacturing, as well as a European Council for remanufacturers. It is worth noting that in the UK alone, the remanufacturing market is currently valued at 2.4 billion, but it has the potential to increase to 5.6 billion going forward. Now, other trends which may contribute towards a circular economy in this sector are the advent of personal manufacture, such as 3D or additive printing, as this can open up opportunities for material optimization. And there is also a growing demand now for smaller, more responsive supply channels. Some companies, as you know, are actively reshoring manufacturing activity back to the UK as they realise the benefits of co-locating design and development with production and assembly. This could prove highly beneficial in terms of closing the loop on certain material streams. So the format for this session is, first of all, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, and then we'll lead into the panel discussion. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Richard Harris, a manufacturing expert from Durham University. Richard has fed into a prominent report which was released last year called The Future of Manufacturing. And this study was particularly significant as it highlighted the growing importance of the circular economy as a means of safeguarding material flows for this sector. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Richard.
Okay, just as a one-sentence preamble, when I joined the lead expert group, and that's the report, the picture of it, The Future of Manufacturing, which was probably about 2 years ago, I have to be honest and say that I went in and the agenda that I saw for manufacturing was all kinds of things to do with productivity, exporting, the role of government in terms of how it sustains technology, innovation, and so on. The notion of the environmental side of it was not high on my particular agenda. There were other colleagues on the lead expert group to which it was. But I have to say that after 18 months of the group of academics, industrialists all coming together and thinking through, nobody would have left that particular lead expert group not recognizing the central important role of the whole environmental, the whole sustainable role for manufacturing. You cannot talk about manufacturing and manufacturing in the future without bringing in these aspects. So that said, it's a long report. I've got less than 15 minutes now, so I'm going to concentrate on just what was the highlights within the sector, within the report on, if you like, the sustainable part. And we started from the basis, the current basis, that of course we still have a manufacturing model that we adhere to, which is linear, make, use, dispose. That's the overwhelming approach to manufacturing. Whereas the Foresight report highlighted, in fact, what it saw as 3 future phases. You can see the dates there, 2013, obviously that's when we were writing it, to 25, efficiency and resilience of inputs. Then new models like remanufacturing, and then the circular economy from 2050 onwards. And that was our brief, to look to 2050. It's difficult to look to next year, let alone 2050, but that's what we had to do. So let me go through very quickly those three areas. So in terms of resource efficiency, obviously the first part of it is to reduce material inputs, therefore costs, moving to alternative, low energy cost, low material usage. And it's estimated, we got commissioned work, and which fed in the fact that it's accepted that there are large potential profit gains to all manufacturing companies going down this route. Perhaps as high as 20% cost savings are available. But we were also informed by the research we commissioned that only the best practice leading edge firms in the UK are actually engaged in this. In fact, the UK came out as pretty much a mediocre performer vis-à-vis the best performers within the European Union. So the UK is not at the front edge of doing this kind of thing, except for a few best practice firms. What's meant by this resource efficiency in more detail? Well, things like reuse, the use of second-hand markets, remanufacturing, returning goods, products at the end of their life to the original equipment manufacturer specification, and of course recycling. But the emphasis, as it says in the report, is that the top two are key goals and will have a major impact, but the bottom one has a much more limited impact in terms of realizing resource efficiency. And what I just want to emphasize in that bottom line where it says the use of new products, what's being talked about there is not the circular economy model, but it's about extracting raw materials from disposed products and being used by others to produce new products. So it's not the firms themselves doing that. Moving on to the second phase, the 2025 to 50 phase, the new models. Well, efficiency improvements will come in phase one, as we saw it, are not enough. Most firms stop at that point. They make their cost savings, and that's it. What they need to do, what we were being presented with, is the need to reinvest such savings, to reinvestment in developing sustainable inputs, and investing in new manufactured products. And there's also a need for more support for research and commercialization, the valley of death syndrome, which I'll come back to in a couple of minutes' time. Now, if that happens, if there is that reinvestment of the cost savings, then you will get greater security of supplies, especially energy and raw materials. Everyone uses the analogy of China buying up specialized metals, which they have done, but obviously more general security. Reduced price volatility and obviously new jobs with less environmental impact attached to those jobs. It requires new business models, a new culture, a new way of thinking about things, and it needs the development and the exploitation of new technologies. Technologies which, to some extent, we don't know about yet. They haven't come along. We're not fully aware of them, although the initial phases are probably fairly well known. And then lastly, the last phase, the circular economy, well, that does require a much more radical change in the way manufacturers, the way firms actually look at the producing products, developing new products. And that means that the innovation cycle needs to be enhanced. It needs to be enhanced as part of the process, and I'll give you a diagram in a second of the circular economy to show that. It needs full remanufacturing, and it needs reduction and elimination of waste. So here's that diagram on the circular economy, which features in our I'm sure you've seen it before. It's one of those ones that is probably doing the rounds quite a bit nowadays. I just want to highlight 4 parts of that circular economy, the 4 parts of it. The design for longevity, and I think the emphasis here is on design, building design into the process. The design for service. Manufacturing and services are not 2 distinct industries. They are very strongly interlinked, and we now talk about manu services or servitization of manufacturing. There's also the design for reuse in manufacturing, and lastly, the design for material recovery. So all of those design processes are part of the business model. It's integral. It's the way of thinking. It's how firms are needing to develop in order to achieve a circular economy. Okay, now that is a very, very quick, brief overview of a chapter of the Foresight project, hardly doing it justice, but I wasn't given too much time to do it justice. But I want to go on and develop a little bit in terms of my own thinking. I want to ask the questions, what will achieve and drive sustainability? Now, it's touched on in the Foresight report, but as an economist, I'm coming at it as an economist, I'm trying to ask the questions in my mind, what will make firms move in this direction? Those three phases. Well, the first one is rising energy and material prices. Okay, oil prices gone down 25% recently, but the general trend for all energy and material prices over the last 20, 30 years in real terms has been much higher, higher than the level of consumer price inflation. There's been rising costs. That means, and those costs have risen because there's scarcity of supplies and there's excess demand. And economics is all about demand and supply. Put those two together and you'll see rising prices. And that will push firms into sustainability, those rising prices. They have to react to a rising cost base on the material input side. Secondly, the technical ability to actually substitute new, cheaper alternatives for current inputs. But those alternatives have to provide the firm with the same input, the input it needs. And it has to do that with fewer resources. It has to be technologically compatible. It has to be cost effective. So technology, the development of technology, will be absolutely crucial in this area. There's also going to be the need to generate new revenue streams. And what I mean by that, in terms of the circular economy in particular, remanufacturing in particular, is not only producing the primary product, but also taking waste outputs, the side effects of producing manufactured products, and producing these, from these waste products, additional products that can be sold, for which there are markets that consumers are willing to purchase. Okay, so the need for those additional products alongside primary products is going to generate these new revenue streams. Unless the firms get those revenue streams, they're not going to want to go down that route. And that, of course, ties up with new business models and with design built into those models. And lastly, and not least, consumers must be willing to pay more for goods produced with zero waste. It's going to cost, in comparative terms to today, more for consumers, and they've got to be willing to do that. So let me just very, very briefly talk about some issues. And let me start off by saying that, new technologies will come along. They're bound to. Science is always going to come up with new ideas. But there's always going to be a challenge in terms of commercialization of that new technology. And there you have up there a diagram that shows how uncertainty and the value of death syndrome builds in. So it's a product life cycle. The red line there is showing the sales, which of course at the product development and the introduction side are either zero or very low. And the blue line shows profits, which of course are negative until fairly well in, if not towards the end of the introduction stage. Now just taking that product development and introduction stage, the key crucial part, and concentrating on that, here is an example of the development of the electric car, the Tesla electric car. So what you've got in that grey line is the profitability, which doesn't actually become profitable, doesn't cross the horizontal axis till way into the process. So all that time, firms are sinking money into the development of the product and getting nothing in return. Well, getting zero profit in return. So research, development, there's all kinds of things. You can see the Tesla Model S developed about halfway in that introduction stage, and then the valley of death, the commercialization. Firms finding it very difficult to get economic resources, investment. Business angels aren't going to be involved in the valley of death part. It takes much more long-term sustainable investment. And then you've got Candy, which is the Chinese developer of the electric car, who have come in once all the hard work, or some of the hard work's been done by the American company. You know, once they've seen a success, once they've seen or gone through the trough of illusionment, as it said there, there's a chance of others coming on board. So that leads me to talk about just a couple of additional issues. Okay, so technology I've just dealt with, and the need to be able to commercialize. But the second thing is that firms in today's world are encouraged to be lean manufacturers, concentrate on their core competencies. So multi-production of primary goods and these waste outputs, if you like, the additional things, is more an exception than a rule in today's cultural environment about how manufacturing goes about doing things. Secondly, customers will need to be wealthier over time to pay for this green premium. Now that means the economy needs to grow, and we have growth at the moment, but more importantly, the economy needs to have wage growth so that people can afford to pay the green premium. And we do not have that in the British economy now. And a lot of economists are wondering, you know, how long will it take for it to come about? And last but not least, there clearly is a need for government involvement to overcome barriers, particularly that valley of death syndrome. There needs to be clear incentives, more certain incentives, more direct engagement of government, not just simple subsidy, but engagement in what are the barriers to the process and how can government be most effective in terms of doing that. I don't know if that was 15 minutes, but hopefully pretty close to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Richard. That was very insightful. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel to you now. We obviously got Richard Harris sat next to me, and then on from Richard is Nick Shields, who's Director of the Scottish Manufacturing Advisory Board. Next to Nick, we have Professor Scott McGregor, Vice Principal at the University of Strathclyde, that is leading on this new remanufacturing hub in Scotland. We then have Richard Clifford, Studio Director for MacLab, which is Scotland's first open access digital fabrication studio. And last but not least, we have Louise McGregor, Head of Market Development at Zero Waste Scotland. Now, what I'd like to do, obviously, we'd like to take as many audience questions as possible, but I'd like to raise a few discussion points first to lead into this. I'd like to begin by asking each panellist to give a brief opening statement outlining the work they are doing in this field, but also bearing in mind we're after a Scottish perspective here. Perhaps if you all could try to answer this question within your opening statement, which is how well placed is Scotland's manufacturing base to take advantage of the opportunities that a circular economy presents? And if we can start maybe with Louise at the end.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I think in Scotland there's significant remanufacturing already happening, and the significant opportunities do exist as well. So recently, in partnership with Scottish Enterprise, Zero Waste Scotland has commissioned some work, which Oakdean Hollins is delivering at the moment, really to look at the state of remanufacturing in Scotland and also to look at the opportunities for remanufacturing going forward. And some early results of that work indicate that, a conservative estimate really of about £500 million worth of activity is already happening in Scotland in remanufacturing. And some of the key sectors involved in that are aerospace, defence and marine, IT, automotive, equipment. So we have actually got significant activity going on already. And it's probably fair to reflect that these sectors generally are using complex and valuable equipment and products, which is why there's this economic drive really for remanufacturing. So I guess the opportunity for Scotland very much lies in our ability to take that experience and to transfer that knowledge into other sectors, and also down the supply chain of those large-scale businesses as well within Scotland. So I can certainly see the different phases that Richard's mentioned. I think there are some challenges for Scotland in recognising some of those, and the challenges around the remanufacturing side of things. And I think we've got to think about all those phases in a slightly different way. We've got a legacy of products to deal with and existing manufactured products, and then we've got this deep shift to more innovation around moving to a circular economy. So some of the challenges, I think, around realising some of these opportunities are access to products. So remanufacturers need to be able to access sufficient quantities of products that come back into them. So that needs better supply chain collaboration, something we heard about quite a lot in the earlier session. Take-back systems and more regulatory clarity around whether those materials are products or whether they're wastes. There also needs to be more demand for these materials and products. So recognition throughout the supply chain that remanufactured products are of similar quality and equivalent to new. And I think probably in some cases better than new because of the diagnostics that goes on within remanufacturing as part of the process. And also this technical expertise, which I think was also picked up on earlier, both to remanufacture effectively now and also to design for remanufacturing in the future. So just to sort of answer your question, Maxine, about how well placed is Scotland, although there are these significant challenges, I think Scotland is very well placed to realise these opportunities. And I think significant progress is already being made. So first of all, you heard the clear policy direction from the Cabinet Secretary this morning. So that places Scotland at the forefront of thinking in this way. We're doing quite a lot of work, as I've already mentioned, on understanding the level of remanufacturing in Scotland and of some of the opportunities to expand that. And also the launch of the Scottish Institute for Remanufacture will be a real strength and a platform really for assisting Scottish industry going forward to develop opportunities. And it will work in close collaboration with Scottish Enterprise, with SMAS, with ourselves, and really provide tools, I think, for increased innovation and increased technical expertise within the sector. The other opportunity we have is the recent Procurement Reform Act in Scotland, which can be very much a tool to stimulate some of the demand for remanufactured products, and I think there's some real benefits to that. And then, last but not least, really, is the work that Sandy sort of talked about this morning through the Ellen MacArthur C100 membership and that collaborative platform that he talked about. And because we're linked into that already, we have got the ability to link SMEs in Scotland to some of these global supply chains that are willing to change and do something differently. Thank you.
Great to hear such level of detail there. If we can go to Richard Clifford now.
Yeah, I think I'm probably coming from the exact opposite point of view, from the sort of grassroots movement that's actually pretty strong. I would sort of reflect on something that Richard mentioned in his presentation, and it's about that lag. And for us, we're sort of seeing from the other end of the spectrum, there's a necessity to adopt these principles because of a lag, not only in economic value to the companies that they're operating on much tighter budgets, for example, but also there's a cultural shift, and sheer necessity means that this grassroots movement is actually pretty strong. I think the other sort of bit, we are actually sort of almost 100% coming from the design point of view. So we are very sort of involved at the initial conception of an idea and that delivery through maybe more traditional manufacturing techniques. We are the ones that are going out talking about the next generation of manufacturing processes. That the one that everyone's talking about is obviously 3D printing. It's not a new process, it's 34 years old as a process. However, it's now that size. And that's where the sort of the kind of change or shift for us is becoming quite sort of pertinent or relevant at a grassroots level. Because these technologies are becoming more accessible, they have a more immediate impact on smaller scale economy. So I think there's an interesting position, sort of somewhere in between that we've found ourselves, which is that grassroots movement, which are actually the ones taking the policies off of the paper and exploring them by playing with that idea. And that inevitably is the stuff that we then uncover through work with Ellen MacArthur and RSA and others. So it's a sort of interesting time. I actually think Scotland's at a really a sort of key shift where those little ones that we might consider the digital craft industries, the arts industries, the design industries, not to be that majorly impacting on manufacturing process. I actually think that's a complete shift at the moment. And actually they're the ones that are feeding all this work into the supply chain. So they have to be sort of integral to that whole process as well. So implementing design and knowledge at a very young, sort of early stage in the whole process, I think is inevitably the way that we have to go.
Great. And if we could have Scott, your thoughts, please.
Okay. I think with regards to the ability for us to accelerate and to move quickly, I think, earlier Richard spoke about new models and new business models. I think we need to consider new models, not just about business, but about how we actually move forward the agenda. And these are really about engagement models where we can access resources, we can get all the stakeholders involved. And the new Scottish Institute for ReManufacturing is an attempt to do that, where it's bringing together academia, it's bringing together the support agencies in terms of the Funding Council and Zero Waste Scotland. But what it's importantly doing is bringing industry into the equation. So whilst the new centre has been announced, what hasn't been conveyed is what the technical scope and the remit of the centre is going to be, because that is very much got to be defined by industry to meet industry needs. And I think over the last few years I've seen in a lot of different sectors where universities, for example, are getting much better at listening to industry and being able to harness their capacity and their capability to support industrial impact. And I think this is where, from my perspective, we have a big opportunity that we can get the stakeholders together. Not only are we getting access to the resources which are coming through the establishment of the likes of this new institute, but it also gives us the opportunity to gear those resources and get significant funding from national bodies and from European bodies. And I think the sooner we bring that activity together, not only is it giving us the opportunity for new innovation and new technology, but it's opening up our networking, our education, our policy, and I think that holistic approach is something which would allow us to move forward quite quickly.
Great, super. Nick?
Okay. I would heartily recommend the report that Richard participated in. The policymakers around the globe, particularly in the developed countries, have a real agenda to drive manufacturing up the way in terms of its contribution to the economy. Currently in Scotland, it represents around 12%. The European Union, the UK, the Scottish Government have got real ambitions to grow that. So if we want to grow that section of the community, or the economy, we need to do it in the most sustainable manner possible. And I think we're at a great starting point for that. Many of the traditional linear supply chains disappeared from Scotland in the last 30 years. They've kind of consumer electronics industries, etc. What's left now are primarily higher cost sort of capital goods businesses that are ideally suited for the circular use. These products have significant residual value, and it was alluded to earlier on. Many businesses in Scotland have actually have always traditionally adopted these models of business. It's just not been defined in the way that we talk about it now. So I think there is a great opportunity to look at the remanufacturing, the circular model, and use that as part of the growth proposition for manufacturing. We're seeing in the next 10 years there will be something like 1 billion new consumers worldwide, all demanding higher quality goods. They want to buy these goods from Europe. That's where we live. They don't. They live in the more developing economies. They're also looking for better infrastructure, better transportation systems. Again, those type of business-to-business, high-value capital goods are really where we can hopefully excel. So I absolutely see an opportunity for Scotland to participate in that. I welcome today's announcements and look forward to see how we can engage the manufacturing in Scotland on these opportunities, but in a more sustainable manner.
Brilliant. And Richard, if you'd just like to give some thoughts on Scotland and how well placed it is.
I think in relation to Scotland, you've got to look at the mix of industry that's here. And if you take, for example, the food and drink industry, I'm going to leave oil out of this, but if you take the food and drink industry, then clearly sustainability is a very large element of what will drive future growth in that sector. So it clearly is an imperative. As I started off by saying at the beginning, I don't think you can talk about manufacturing, I don't think you can talk about manufacturing in the future without talking about sustainability. But it's going to require quite a strong integrated approach from both government, from the resourcing of the various institutes that have been set up in Scotland, from the linkages with the manufacturing organisations, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important component of the sector are those that are involved in the manufacturing. So it's getting them on board and getting them to be buying into the process. And as I said, getting them to realise that it's not just a utopia, it's not just you should do it because, well, it's an ethical issue, but you should do it because it's a way of achieving growth, sustainability, and ultimately profitability and survival. That is a big agenda. I suspect that both in Scotland, the UK, the world more generally, it's still at the early stages of engaging firms. And I'm not talking about big firms. I'm not talking about, big manufacturing organizations that are already involved in it, who already are converts, if you like. It's the vast, vast majority. 80% plus of manufacturers are small, very small, employing less than 20 individuals. It's getting those engaged to make a real big difference and ensuring an upward trend in manufacturing rather than the trend that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years. We had a standing joke in the lead expert group. We were trying to predict, because it's part of our remit, when would manufacturing employment hit zero. And just taking the trend line, it was probably somewhere in 2030. Just if you don't do anything, then that's where Britain would end up. All those jobs would be elsewhere, would move abroad. There is now real opportunity to change that around, but it does involve the engagement, I think, of the firm sector to make it happen. All the initiatives are great, are necessary, but you need to engage that sector.
Great, thanks. But before we go to audience questions, I'd just like to touch on the ReManufacturing Hub that's being launched. That there are quite a few barriers to remanufacturing out there. And I just wonder, one of them is collaboration, and what level of appetite there is for manufacturers and remanufacturers to collaborate on this to help scale up models. Competitive sensitivities must be a sticking point here, I'd imagine. And perhaps, Scott, if you could give some thoughts to this.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a concern that companies have about collaboration that involves perhaps sharing their IP, etc. But I think over the last few years, one of the things that has matured quite well is companies' engagement with universities. So I can give you examples of whereby we've been able to overcome that. There's an advanced forming research centre in Shinnon, and part of that centre's makeup has got Tier 1 and Tier 2 industry partners, where the Tier 1 are the big multinationals, the Tier 2s are the supply chain. So we have situations there where we have companies such as Rolls-Royce and Boeing who are effectively collaborating and agreeing on particular areas of technology development where they will both benefit, that there will be no issue with regards to ownership. As long as they're getting access to that, then that is fulfilling their needs, and provided that we've got the right framework to allow that to happen, then I think we're seeing more and more instances where previously organisations were reluctant to collaborate. They're now doing that. I think the other benefit is that quite often we're seeing the secondary pull-through of the development of new technologies, where larger organisations are then asking their supply chain to get involved and to take on the adoption of that technology. So I would see that as being another benefit that we would get through being able to essentially have mature discussions about how we collaborate and ensure that technology benefit both large and small organisations.
Mm-hmm. Great. And would any of the panel like to just touch on another barrier, which is consumer perception of remanufactured goods as perhaps being inferior? Perhaps, Louise, would you like to just offer your thoughts there briefly?
Yeah, so I think this obviously is an issue. I think there's probably no understanding amongst consumers generally about what remanufactured products are, and I think there are a number of different standards covering remanufactured products. I think when you get remanufacturers operating in a particular supply chain, and there's an example of a business in Scotland that remanufactures gearboxes, and they remanufacture them for maintenance of vehicles in Scotland, then there's quite a clear understanding within that supply chain of the value of those parts and the quality of those parts. But in a broad sense, there probably isn't. So there probably is something that needs to be done around sort of educating particular supply chains. Whether the education needs to go to the consumer level, I suppose, depends on the product that we're talking about, whether an industrial product or, you probably don't know in your car whether you've got a remanufactured gearbox or not. As long as it works and it's got the guarantees in place, then perhaps that isn't so much of an issue. So I think it's something that needs to be considered definitely, and it's something that is definitely within the kind of frame of the Institute of Remanufacture to sort of develop that.
Okay, brilliant. I'd like to bring the audience in now. I think we have a roving mic somewhere. Does anybody here have a question for the panel? Yes, we have a gentleman at the back. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that'd be great.
Thank you. Norman Lett from Ball Packaging. I'd just like to touch on the consumer acceptance, because for me it is absolutely vital, because we can manufacture nearly anything, but unless we sell it, it's just a waste of time. So it is the absolute key. And I have to say, I've been collecting a number of academic papers, and we've had our own experience within our company as well. Consumer acceptance of remanufactured or currently second-hand goods is extremely poor. They believe them to be inferior, and there's a lot of academic studies that voice that out. And we actually manufactured ourselves a product which we took it to market as the world's lightest beverage can, and we really struggled to sell it. So now we've taken it back in-house, we've rebranded it, and now we're actually saying that this is the optimum can for the market. Oh, and by the way, there are some very interesting environmental benefits as well. And interestingly enough, we found academic papers which actually support that perception of consumer acceptance. So I think there's a tremendous amount of work that is required to be done on consumer acceptance before we actually progress very far down this route. Otherwise, we will remain niche, and we will remain at extremely low prices, which will be unattractive.
Yeah, very, very interesting point. Richard Clifford, would you like to, because I'd imagine that we need some creativity here in the engagement agenda, and you're coming from a different perspective, but I'd imagine, you are design-led. What do you think can be done to increase the consumer appeal of remanufactured products?
I think there's various ways. Not only is there a myth that it will inevitably be more expensive. For example, the gearboxes might work out more cost efficient because they're not being completely remanufactured, they're just being restored in some way. I think there's a misconception that inevitably it will be more expensive, or that it's a sort of luxury. I think a lot of the work that we do is actually trying to get in before that perception is there, and it's trying to get in and actually give people a hands-on experience. I'm sort of looking around the room and see various faces that had this experience with us last week, and it's sort of making it tangible. Taking those, as I sort of said it earlier, taking those words out of the reports and making it something really tangible that people really understand. For example, there's obviously infinite materials that we're talking about, sort of that we can keep reusing. However, natural resources, we need to get away from that. And if we actually break that down into real terms, that we won't have smartphone screens if we don't start reusing certain materials. Actually make it something that really hits hard. I think we're quite into sort of hard hitting and not sort of softening the edges, because we have to realise the real importance is not only economic, it's social as well. And I think that's actually where designers need to step up. They actually need to step up and say, well, look, here's the thinking that we're doing, and this is who we want to partner with. From our experience, there's massive barriers there in terms of us or people that we're working with getting into industry, and really that collaborative kind of forum is still quite difficult. However, I totally agree that the universities have become more receptive. Companies are starting to become more receptive to that sort of kind of back and forth, the kind of hand-holding process as well. And it's really just the access for the innovators who might be designers, but that might be consumer-led innovation as well. And it's that access into this discussion that I think is actually the sort of little stumbling block at the moment. And it's something that we're trying to maybe make a bit of a dent on by making things more tangible. That these stats and these figures and graphs don't mean a lot to the consumers who aren't burying or digging down into the detail of it. They don't mean that much to them. However, if we can put that in more tangible, sort of realistic terms for them, that means you will not have your smartphones in 20 years because all the materials locked up in 20 years ago, the last 20 years worth of smartphones. Making it that obvious, I think, is actually something that we need to sort of focus a bit more on.
Great. Do we have some other questions for our panellists? Yes, we have a gentleman at the front.
Hello, James Owen from SCS. It's a question on customers again, but not quite an acceptance based on ethical grounds, but more on cost. And it's something that Professor Harris said in his speech, was that zero-waste products would have to be more expensive. And I had a bit of an issue with that from looking at the renewable energy sector and how unsuccessful the likes of Ecotricity have been and Good Energy have been to bring zero-carbon electricity into the mainstream with a price premium. And the big six are still the big six. So my question is, if the public don't accept paying more for zero waste, does zero waste fail?
Great question. Perhaps Richard Harris, you could pick up on this.
I think at the end of the day, consumers are becoming more discerning in terms of the type of products that they're buying. You know, it's much more individuals wanting a product to be something that is personalized with what they are perceiving to be what it's offering them, the need, and so on. And I think part of that is actually convincing consumers that it's not just the consumption of that product, but it's also the impact of the consumption of that product on others, on society, on sustainability. I don't think you can get around the fact that if you're going to get people to pay a premium, that they're going to have to accept that the price, the additional price they're paying, is something for something, not something for nothing. They're not paying a premium just because they are ethically that way inclined. So I think there is a need of branding the product to actually ensure that people are understanding that they're buying more than just the consumption of that product itself, but there are what economists would call spillovers. There are other impacts on society, on sustainability, on the future, that we as individual consumers need to price in and be willing to pay for. So it's an education process to some extent. I mean, the flip side of it in some ways is you look at perceptions of going in and doing a manufacturing job. And of course, the perception is that manufacturing jobs are dirty, low-paid, factory-based jobs. Well, it's far from it in today's environment. But that's still the perception out there. So it's a matter of in part, an education process. And I think you also tie that consumer willingness to pay, as I said, with affordability. If we don't have the wealth spread across the economy in order to pay that premium, then obviously individuals are going to find that more difficult. So why pay a premium for higher electricity if you can't afford to pay your current electricity bill?
Yeah, sure.
There should not be a premium for zero waste products, and the whole concept of the circular economy is around making economic products that people will want to buy, and actually for the same sort of price as existing products. And I think we've just got to take this in the context of what we mean. I think if we look at business as usual, prices of products are going to start going up anyway. We're in a constrained environment. Resources are reducing. There's more price volatility around that. We've already started to see some of that. So we're going to see prices increasing anyway. And I think one of the challenges we've got to overcome is ensuring that the work we do around remanufacturing designs and develops products that actually do sell at a price that doesn't have a premium on it. Otherwise, I think it probably will fail.
Do we have any other thoughts or questions for our panel? Gentleman in the third row.
Hi, it's just really following on from the issue about price. Should we be looking at tax breaks for, because there will be a cost to the nation if we don't deal with those sort of things now. Should we be looking at tax breaks to drive remanufacturing? I'm just thinking, you know, we have some fantastic remanufacturing companies that have been operating in Scotland for a long time, things like the people refitting ships. And you wonder whether we're losing those, and those companies are under threat. Thinking of what was Caledonian Airmotive in Prestwick, was a fantastic remanufacturing company that did, just as Louise suggests, produce jet engines to a higher standard than when they were new. But that's under threat by the cost of labour in Taiwan, making it more appealing for General Electric to take that business out of Scotland. I think, you know, we really have to, if we are serious about this, we have to look at ways of making it attractive to locate these things in Scotland and keep those making skills which are critical to this whole process, and keep those in Scotland. And I just wanted the panel think about delivering tax breaks and tax incentives to keep that kind of business and drive that kind of business where it exists already in Scotland.
Great. Nick, perhaps you'd like to take this one up first?
I guess I'm always fascinated by the cost thing. I think we all benefited in the last 30 years from vastly reduced prices of electronic goods coming in from the Far East, and Richard will reflect on this. Those are effectively designed to be disposed. There's no residual value at the end of them. I was shocked when I took my last CRT television down to my local recycling centre to find it full of flat screen televisions already, and I thought, God, I'm really behind the game here. Quite embarrassing. Nobody knew what I was carrying into them. But you know, back in the day when we all got our first colour televisions, for those who remember the 70s, we hired them. We didn't buy them. You know, there was obviously residual use in them. So there's the whole supply chain got sucked into this low-cost, disposable. And where are the new technologies and products going to emerge from? And it's, you know, for companies who are involved, it's trying to encourage them up the value chain to see where are the newer technologies and where are the newer innovative ideas and models that oddly enough almost tap into Richard's sense of paying more, but we see the value in it, and therefore we buy into that model that we used to have about renting things like televisions and things like that. We seem to have lost now because we want to own it. It needs to be ours. There's a social thing going on there. So, you know, and that I think is a real merge of technology, social behaviours, and the bigger businesses sort of dictating what we do. So there's no silver bullet. That would be recyclable, I'm sure. We have to sort of rethink a new model, and I think back to what Richard's report sort of talks about. We need to invent those new models going forward, and there's no simple solutions. But it's those knowledge businesses, sort of what was referred to down at. I was down there this summer actually. How we drive them up the value chain and just make sure that their proposition just isn't competing with what is always, there's always going to be somewhere cheaper than Scotland to make things. So therefore, don't make those kind of products. Try and drive your business up the value chain and look at how you can and enhance the value of your proposition. So I think we should always look at trying to protect that, but just, you know, in a sense, not subsidising it just because it's cheaper to do it somewhere else, but to try and make them more innovative, access the university facilities and push them up the value chain.
Great. I think, Scott, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think the question was quite right. I think that there does need to be positive intervention with regards to premiums and costs, because when you consider what's happened in the renewable energy area, that's only been made attractive for organisations when they've access to the low carbon energy fund, when there's been renewable obligation certificates, and they've brought these out, and you know, there has been a premium on electricity in order to provide that resource. I think we have to look at something like this to get a positive intervention which will get us somewhere quicker.
And Richard, I think you wanted to add a few thoughts there.
Yeah, it was just to sort of reflect on what you said about sort of taxation of that. For example, the construction industry is one of our most wasteful industries. My background is in that industry. And architects can apply for tax credits for R&D. Now, that, looking at the graph of that lag, then the major expense is during the research development stages. So being able to utilise things like tax credits, for example, during that stage, I think is actually more sustainable than trying to implement it when it's already been ill-conceived, when it's already been sort of made and is just going into the manufacturing process. I think being able to utilise, and I don't know what other industries that applies to, but I definitely know that architects can apply for those tax credits. Now, whether those are the ones who should be getting that, we don't know, but equally, I think there's possibly something aligned with that in terms of manufacturing as well. And if those can be pulled through, the universities are now becoming a really great mechanism that they can actually, through sort of innovation centres and others, they can pull that resource, and each of these parties are coming to the table with a bit of breathing space. And the whole thing's not going to progress unless each company can sort of afford that breathing space. That's why we've got into this mess, is because we're competing with sort of lower cost industries that are providing us with cheap disposable items, and it's not going to last. So that's where I think actually that breathing space, and if there's sort of breathing within the taxation, or whether it's credits or an offset or something, then either that helps to offset the reducing the cost, or just actually gives them that space to think about it in the first place.
Great. I think we have one more time. Time for one more question. Do we have anybody with a burning comment to make? Yes, gentleman, just here on the second row.
Eric Randall from Bryson Recycling, based in Northern Ireland. Perhaps as much of an observation to comment on as a direct question. Sitting here listening to the debate and listening to the presentations this morning from Sandy, you get a sense of the enormity of this particular subject matter, and how different the solutions are going to be, one material type to another, or one waste stream to another. The easy, low-hanging fruit is the stuff that's directly under our control, and that will be probably local authority collected recyclables for which you have direct control over and can actually do something to change. The more difficult stuff, you're into global supply chains involving Chinese-produced electronic equipment with sub-manufacturing dotted around the world, and you're trying to influence a supply chain which is so beyond our actual control. I suppose my point I'm coming to is, I'm not convinced I've seen a real honesty yet about the things that are easily within our control, and the issues around, take glass manufacturing. We know what the problem is. That's a quality issue supply to glass manufacturers who exist already, and there's already potentially under threat by the way we actually carry out recycling across the UK, really. So really, I'll throw that out as a challenge to how are we going to be honest about the issues that are under our control before we try and really unpick the ones that are outside our control?
That's a great question. I'd like to get each of the panelists' thoughts on this, really. We talk about global supply chains. There's huge barriers here around data, around transparency, around system leakages. So when materials become waste because they escape out of the system, what can be done really to start assessing this in an honest way? We can start with Richard Harris.
I think what comes to mind in terms of certainly global supply chains is the analogy that often is people talk about is, you take the Apple iPhone and you look at the fact, yes, it is manufactured in China, but only 11% of its total value added is actually produced in China itself. The vast majority of the value of that phone is, of course, the intellectual property, the design that is put in California by the corporation. And people are willing to pay, and it is a premium here. I don't have an iPhone. My phone rings as well as anyone else's and connects as well as anyone else's. But I would never convince my wife to go anything other than an iPhone, because she likes all the other services, all the additions that she's willing to, or we are willing to pay a premium for. So, yeah. No, we pay for both. I'm not trying to make a sexist point here. So I think at the end of the day that in terms of manufacturing supply chains, global value-added supply chains, it's about moving up the value-added part of that chain. It's ensuring that what's being produced in economies like Scotland, the UK, Western economies, is more the higher value-added side of it, and not getting hung up on trying to compete against the bolting and assembling and putting it together part of the value chain. It's in the design. It's in the knowledge base that surrounds those products. And I do think, just to come back on this notion of why should there be an additional premium to pay in terms of products that are produced, say, with zero waste. Well, I think it's not that there's a premium, it's just that there's a recognition of the total cost that's involved here. That people are paying a price that reflects not just the basic product and what it provides, but the ancillary aspects to that product, the environmental impact, the sustaining impact, what's going to happen if you ignore those kind of issues type impact. So I think all in all that it's positioning within the value chain, which is important, not trying to compete on cost basis.
Great, and briefly, Nick.
Sure. I think not that a lot of this will be covered, but I certainly see the economics and population boom and growing consumer class across the world just making these resources more and more expensive. You know, economically we're going to have to adopt these sort of policies, and a lot of the compliance comes in because we want to, and we think it's we want to do things for the environment. I think there's going to be some basic economics that drives this sort of behaviour. So I do see that will force us all to sort of reevaluate the price that we pay for things, and perhaps buying things that we know will last a lot longer, and rather than just have it for a year and we throw it. So again, there will be a reevaluation of how we consume, I would imagine, in the next 20 to 30 years.
Scott?
Yeah, I think in terms of reflecting on the honesty aspect, I'm not sure that just now we've really pulled everything together the way we should be pulling it together to identify how we can best make an impact. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that there is such a challenge out there that we're never going to be able to address every one of these challenges or compete. But I think there are niche areas that we can compete. I think the important aspect here is going to be to build the stakeholder engagement to identify these, but importantly, we've got to get the resources put behind them in order to make progress. I think, I see quite a lot of instances where across the sector, one of the challenges is that people are just working almost nose to the grindstone, and they don't have the resources and the capacity to try and make much of a difference just now. I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we get the policy support and we get the premium and resource support in order to make this happen.
Great, and Richard?
I think there's a really interesting shift from sort of reflecting on what you're saying about, okay, there's certain things that we can immediately impact on, and there's certain things that we might perceive as being beyond our limits at the moment. I think what's happening is that manufacturing of certain, and they might be the ones that are more responsible, I wouldn't go as far as say best practice, but maybe slightly better practice than they were. I think those are the ones that are actually taking manufacturing not only local, but it's starting to become sort of hyper-local. It's not only in the country, and I would say Scotland has been local. I would say it's hyper-local where it's been distributed within communities now. I think that's actually creating a vacuum, and it's broadening the gap between the ones that are taking that as not only their stance, but using it for social reasons, economic reasons, and they're going down, either recovering materials, reusing components, and it's causing a vacuum that I think actually, not to continue the Apple bashing too much, but there's a reason why they then bring out cheaper handsets that are made of cheaper materials. It's because they are seeing that vacuum in front of their eyes, that the high-end disposable products, people are starting to waken up. And we're not waking up quick enough, but they're starting to sort of reduce the quality of their components because they realise that actually the value is not in the item, the value is in the material. So there's an interesting sort of vacuum created in the middle there, and I think that is a model that Scotland's actually pretty well placed as we sort of localise or recollect the manufacturing that we had. I think that's only going to exaggerate that point.
Great, and Louise?
Well, I think we absolutely have to tackle both of these things, the things that we are in control of in Scotland and can do something about fairly immediately. But I think if we don't recognise that actually this big shift towards remanufacturing and circular economy practices is a collaborative matter, and it's collaborative across the world, not just in Scotland, then, you know, if we ignore that then and are not part of that, then I think Scotland will lose out. So I think we absolutely have to focus on both things, and obviously the global stuff will take us a lot longer, but at least we can be part of that. And there are companies in Scotland now who are manufacturing for global supply chains, so we've already got links into some of those. So I think, yes, both, definitely.
Brilliant. Well, I know lunch is being served now in the other room, and I don't want to keep anybody any longer. So if you could just join me in giving our speakers a big round of thanks.